Welcome to 100 Plus, a historical overview of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, the Christian faith, and you. In today's episode, we will be focusing on Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening.
Our view of the past is frequently shaped by just a few data points. As a result, it's often quite simple, even simplistic. For instance, if I was to hand out a blank sheet of paper and say, write down everything you know about the founding of America. Take all the time you want. You would likely write down some events and some names, basically grouped around three moments. First, in the late 15th century, when Columbus showed up. So he's obviously a complicated figure these days, so you may or may not want to say a lot about him, but there's just an awareness that as we talk about the United States, the discovery of America, obviously there were people here, it didn't need to be discovered in that sense, but there's European involvement picks up after Columbus lands. The second thing you'd write about, and by the way, kudos to you if you could put these in the right century, but the second thing that you would write about would be the landing of the Mayflower. So if you've been following in these podcasts, you know that comes in the early 1600s. In any event, you would likely be able to say Mayflower and Pocahontas. You talk perhaps about Thanksgiving, the first Bears-Lions game, Macy's Parade, all that stuff. I give you a gold star if you remembered to mention the Mayflower Compact. I'm not thinking many of you would remember the Mayflower Compact. The third time that you would write about, the third epoch that you would write about, of course, would be what happens 150 years later, the events around 1776. So the Founding Fathers, taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, Declaration of Independence, the Redcoats, King George, Revolutionary War. You could likely parade out a whole bunch of names. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Betsy Ross, of course Hamilton, Hamilton, maybe Madison, Paul Revere. You might add Valley Forge, but I'm thinking if you wrote too much, you'd start to mix in some Civil War kinds of stuff. And so points off for that. My big point here, and I do actually have one, is that we know a bit around a few moments over 300 years. In other words, we don't know much. Not only do we jump over 100-year periods, right, between 1492 and 1607, then 1607 and 1776. I mean, not only are we jumping 150 years at a time, but we don't actually know all that much about what was happening in 1492 or 1607. Now, perhaps you're going to push back on this. You're going to say, no, I actually know a lot about this. Okay, well, then I'm going to cite the Dunning and Kroger effect, which basically says, you only think you know a lot about what was going on if you don't know a lot about what's going on. So this is just the principle that says when we, if we graph how much we know along the vertical axis and how much we actually know, what we have is when we don't know anything, we're down here in the lower left-hand corner, we learn a little bit and we think we know a lot. And then we learn a little bit more and we go, oh, I don't know much. And then it starts to slowly climb over time as we learn more and more. So the fact of the matter is our confidence tends to be significant when we don't know a lot. And then it comes back down into reality as we learn a little bit more about how complicated it is. So look, some people have very strong opinions, very simple answers to very complicated questions, such as, is America a Christian nation? So if you have a very short and simple, comprehensive understanding of that question, then I'm going to push back and say that's only because you don't know much about what we're talking about. It's actually fairly complicated. We will look at it later on. We'll unpack it a little bit. I think it's an important question to wrestle with. But as you learn more, you realize how little you know. So, by the way, as an aside, there's a lot of this going on right now as it relates to all the things about COVID. So I hear from people on both sides of the issue that they're just following the science. And I've almost pushed, I've not done this, but I've almost challenged people and say, oh, well, please explain the science to me. Because I only had a few years of science in college. I had 2 years of chemistry, and I had physics, and I had calculus, and all that stuff. But I would not pretend to understand the science. I rely on the reports from scientists, but I don't understand the science. And I don't think many people understand the science. And if you think you understand the science and you don't have a PhD in virology or other things, we're just relying on other people because it's actually pretty complicated. So Dunning and Kroger just says that if you don't know much, you think you know a lot. As soon as you know more, you realize that it's pretty limited. And this is true when it comes to history. So as we learn a little bit about some things, we might think we can fill in a lot. But history's complicated. Look, we know so very little. Think of all the things that are going on right now. We know so very little about what's actually going on. So you back up 2,000 years. Or in this case, you back up, 400 or 500 years. There's a whole lot of things going on in a whole lot of places. We have a few data reports on a few of them. So that doesn't mean we don't study history. It does. It just means we carry some humility forward as we're trying to build our theories. And we also understand that our understanding of history will continue to change as we learn more things and people put things together later on. All of that is important, that sort of humility, that sort of broader understanding, as we start to move deeper towards a focus not just on church history, but on American history and American church history, because this is where some of us have a little bit more of an understanding. So, by way of context and overview, the last few episodes have been on the 18th century. This is the period of the Enlightenment, the US and French revolutions, Industrial Revolution. I've noted there was a spike in travel and trade, and correspondingly a spike in wealth. This is, we're now getting into the time of slavery expanding, especially in the South, and a creeping spiritual lethargy in Europe and also in the United States. So in the last podcast, I took a brief time out and we looked at books for the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. In the episode just before that, I mentioned the Great Awakening. We've done some focused look at the Wesleys, John and Charles, and also at George Whitefield. Today, we return to the topic of the Great Awakening in general, and I want to talk more specifically about Jonathan Edwards in particular. So, just so you know, we're focused now in this episode on the first Great Awakening, 1730 to 1755. Some date it into the 1720s. These things don't have precise dates, but the first Great Awakening, as opposed to the second Great Awakening, which is the last part of the 18th century, 1790 into the 1840s. And there's actually, it's a debate in history as to whether or not there was a third Great Awakening. Some say there is, some say it wasn't really a Great Awakening. Some challenge the whole idea of the first Great Awakening. But I'm sort of staying in that slipstream that says, yes, there were in fact these very unique and specific revivals. Not unique in the sense that there's not ongoing revivals. The history of the church shows that you've got revival, and then you got decay, and then you got trouble, and then you got revival, and I mean there's sort of patterns to this. What makes the Great Awakenings great is that they tend to be much bigger and sort of spread out, and seem to be a movement of God of some significance. So let me start by reminding you that the Enlightenment is rolling through Europe, Western Europe, and America. And the Enlightenment, this celebration of man, the dethroning of God, the celebration of science and the scientific revolution, the celebration of reason and rationalism over against revelation, over against spiritual truth from the Bible. This was a direct challenge to the Christian faith. Let me also say, life was harsh generally at this time. I mean, you're going to back up into the 1700s. Obviously, we're without a lot of what we just consider to be the necessities of life, all the things that we don't have when we back up 200, 250 years ago. But in addition to the hardship of living back then and the Industrial Revolution, which was causing so many people to move into the city, and you got great poverty and child labor and unsafe working conditions, and you got all that stuff going on. In addition to all the disease and all that stuff that's going on, you have the church is sort of in a low point. There was cultural decline. Now, I guess I should say, lest I be canceled, because I don't think I'm supposed to talk about one culture being better than others. That's it's not considered to be politically correct at this moment. I actually do believe that some cultures are better than other cultures in certain ways. Now, I think we've got to be more comprehensive. Some cultures are really good at things like accumulating power or money, but they tend not to be very good at things like friendships. But different cultures are better at different things than other cultures. And you head into a time of the decay of the culture in the West. So you have a spike in alcoholism and gambling and lotteries and prostitution and these kinds of things. And you have people less interested in matters of faith, less interested in church, less interested in their spiritual formation. So the Christian faith is in a little bit of a valley at this point. So this surprises some because they think, oh, well, you go back to the good old days, and of course you only call the good old days if you're a white male. Otherwise, they certainly were not nearly as good for you as they are today. But lots of people think of the good old days when the church was strong and vibrant and everybody was following Jesus very rigorously. The earlier, the further back you go in America, the thought is the purer the church was and everything was more dialed in. No, so if you read the sermons of people from this time period, and by the way, you can go back and read sermons from the 1600s, 1700s. I always challenge, I don't always, but I occasionally challenge people and say, we tend to think we're smarter than people from the past. Like we have more education. We're better. We're chronological snobs unless we've been challenged on this. We tend to think, there's progress and we're just better. Well, first of all, human nature hasn't changed, so we're not better. But secondly, if you read the sermons that are being delivered to these uneducated people back then, you see that there's a whole lot of people that just are a lot more spiritually adept than we are. But so you can read sermons and realize how much better people generally knew their Bible than we do today. But if you read the sermons over time, you see that we start to head into a point where pastors are frustrated with the spiritual apathy that is going on. So we're 3 generations removed from the Puritans showing up in New England and all the religious fervor that was true there. 3 generations is often a bit of a marker. We see it with David, great love for God. Solomon starts well but fades, and then Solomon's son Rehoboam, right? We got real problems, and so it seems like 3 generations is sort of a hard marker for people to have grown a little bit spiritually lethargic. So what we read is that people are increasingly, the great-grandchildren of those getting off the Mayflower are increasingly focusing on wealth and comfortable living and not so much on the kingdom of God. So there are other things to note, right? This is, we've got the 13 colonies at this point. They are somewhat divided. I mean, you don't have ready communication and transportation. So, and you've also got sort of religious differences between the colonies up and down the eastern coast. So New England is, mostly Puritans, congregational churches. The rest of the seaboard there on the east is not so much exclusively Puritans. You've got Quakers and you've got Anglicans and Lutherans and you've got Baptists and you've got Presbyterians and the Reformed, the Dutch. Southern colonies are mostly, sort of interesting to think about today, southern colonies were mostly Anglican, some Baptists and Presbyterians down there. But you've got you've got these churches that are there by their own reports, not vibrant. So at this point, you have a few things that begin to happen after prayer and seeking God and sermons and other things, where there's some sparks and people are coming to faith. So George Whitefield, talked about Whitefield already, the Oxford-trained member of the Holiness Club, the theatrical preacher with the big booming voice, right, that could preach to 30,000 people without amplification. He enters stage left around this time, both in Europe and then in the States. By the way, Whitefield is the one who followed, a little bit younger than the Wesleys. John is the big preacher and the organizer. Charles is also the pastor. They're both Anglican pastors. Charles is the one who writes all the hymns. John's the one that travels 250,000 miles by horseback and preaches 40,000 sermons in his lifetime. By the way, I did the math as I was preparing this. I have likely preached 4,000 to 5,000 sermons, given 4,000 to 5,000 talks in the course of the 35 years I have been doing this. So John Wesley lived to be 87. If I live to be 87 and I don't retire at all and I keep giving 2 talks per week, then at the end of my life, I will have given 6,700 talks. He gave 40,000. Now, he was traveling by horse. He could give the same sermon, obviously, over and over because it was to smaller groups and different people. But Wesleys are the ones that started Methodism. Again, they remain Anglicans, but they start the Methodist Church. Whitefield is the guy who follows them at Oxford, takes over the Holiness Club. He's the one that's friends with Ben Franklin, although Franklin is a deist, but Franklin is really taken by the charisma and the power and the booming voice of Whitefield. Whitefield is the one who starts the orphanage in Georgia. It's still going, the oldest nonprofit in North America. And I was reading this week a little bit more about Whitefield, and David Garrick, an actor at the time, said he would give 100 guineas if I could say, "Oh," like Mr. Whitefield. And another person said that Whitefield could bring a congregation, bring an audience to tears just by saying Mesopotamia. So obviously, big, booming, theatrical, powerful, unique voice. So Whitefield comes to the United States, and he is traveling up and down the East Coast, and he is preaching outside of churches, in part because the churches, the Anglican churches, he's an Anglican, and Anglicans will again become Episcopalians around this time because as the tension rises between the colonies and Great Britain, if you were living in the colonies, you didn't want to say you were a member of the Church of England when the colonies are going to war against England. So the Anglican Church, the Church of England, becomes the Episcopal Church. He's preaching in these Anglican/Episcopal churches. he would be preaching in those, but he's not invited in. And so he's preaching in the cornfields, and he's preaching in town squares, and he's preaching in other places. And this is going to be unique because it's going to draw people from a variety of churches together for some of the first, concerted efforts in the intra-denominational kind of space. And Whitefield will be one of the ones whose preaching will spark revival that will be eventually what gets labeled the First Great Awakening. Alongside this, somewhat independent, but also very much in concert with the Whitefields and then the Wesleys, you will have Jonathan Edwards, who is a figure many love and many hate. He's such a prominent figure, such an important figure, not just in the church, but sort of in pre-revolutionary America, that you have to learn about him, even if you sort of despise him. And many people despise Edwards because the only thing they know about him is his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which last I looked was still in the Norton Anthology reader used in some high schools. So the basics on Jonathan Edwards: he's born in North America, in Connecticut, in 1703. He'll live to be 55 years old. He's from important stock. His grandfather had been a very prominent pastor in New England. Solomon Stoddard had pastored for 60 years. So he had been a prominent preacher. His father, Edward's father, is a prominent, or is not as prominent as either his father or his son, but he was also an important figure. And interestingly, so when Jonathan Edwards comes to faith, you have to offer, especially in the States, not so much in England at this time. It's more of the established church. You sort of become a member of the church. But now in the colonies, you have got to offer testimony to a conversion experience before you're going to become a member. And this will be important because the way Jonathan handles this is going to eventually lead to him being fired. But when Jonathan Edwards, the young man, Jonathan Edwards, goes to his father to offer his report of his conversion to Christ, he talks about being overwhelmed by the beauty of God and the beauty and the holiness of God as displayed in nature. And he's just completely, he's knocked down by the beauty of God. And his dad doesn't accept this as an acceptable conversion account. At the time, Puritans, your account of your conversion is almost always focused on the way you're crushed by the weight of your sin. And so Edwards will not have his conversion accepted by his father. And this was a big deal. If you're not a member of the church, you can't take communion, and you can't have your own children baptized into the church. So infant baptism at this point throughout the Puritans. And so it's a big deal to not be a member of the church, but his father did not allow him to become a member. So, and by the way, just a little bit more about this this whole problem with membership. Because membership is important, but because they've got these theological standards of what it takes to become a member, part of what will happen, and Solomon Stoddard, so Jonathan Edwards' grandfather, will develop what is called the halfway covenant, which is sort of a crazy term when you know what covenant means. It's sort of a halfway to being really committed. But if you can say, I am a follower of Jesus Christ, I'm committed to following Jesus Christ, but you don't have a conversion story that gets you in the door, gets you a membership, then you could have this halfway covenant acceptance. which allowed you to take communion. And I can't remember if it allowed you to have your children baptized or not, but Solomon Stoddard, Edward's grandfather, used this. He sort of develops this, and he's very outgoing with allowing people to take communion, sees it almost as an evangelistic kind of process. And later on, when Jonathan replaces his grandfather as the pastor of this church, after some time, he is going to challenge the halfway covenant. He just wants to see a level of zeal for Christ that very few people are going to be able to produce. Jonathan Edwards is very disciplined, studies the Bible and theology 12, 13 hours a day, up at 4 a.m., just a very disciplined guy. He wants to see that, sort of expects to see that. And so he sort of comes after some people who he thinks are not particularly rigorous in their faith, and is going to tell them that they can't have communion. And this is going to eventually, in 1750, this is going to lead to him being fired. So anyway, Edwards, I'm getting ahead of myself. I've done that before. Edwards is born in 1703. He is from this prominent Christian family. And if you read about Edwards, you will read that he is perhaps the smartest person ever born in North America. Hard to tell that, but obviously he's a bright boy. He's reading everything at a young age, very precocious. At 11, he publishes an article in a prestigious scientific journal back in England. It was on spiders. So science is coming into its own. People are making observations. He makes observations and gets an article published at the age of 11. At 14, he enrolls at Yale, and that's not all that unusual. Other people were enrolling early on at this point. But he goes to Yale, by the way, because Yale has been started because Harvard has already become liberal. That's the knock on Harvard at this point. He graduates from Yale in 1722 at the age of 19. He was taken when he was at Yale by reading John Locke, and he said he had more delight than most greedy miser finds when gathering up handfuls of silver and gold from the newly discovered treasure. So he loves John Locke. He loves to learn. He also studies a lot of Newton, and I think I've got this right. It's while he's at college that he has his conversion experience. Although, if you read about it, it sort of sounds a lot more like it's a conversion not to faith in Christ. It's more of a conversion to Calvinism. But this brilliance and this commitment to Calvinism is going to characterize Edwards for the rest of his life. So here's the flyover for the rest of his life. After graduation from Yale, he is going to go back to apprentice with his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, and he'll do this for 2 years. He's not really in a classic associate pastor role. He's a little bit more of a scholar in residence kind of role. The hope is that he's going to, write things and be brilliant as he was. His grandfather will pass away in 1729, and at that point he becomes the sole preacher of the Congregational Church in Northampton, Massachusetts, which was west of Boston. Backing up a little bit, when he was 20, he met a woman who will become his wife, Sarah Pierpont. They'll be married after 4 agonizing years of courtship. Edwards was described as gawky and intense. That does sound like a painful courtship if you're gawky and intense. But their marriage is celebrated as being a great marriage. They will have 11 children. In 1734, Edwards, frustrated with the spiritual state of the people, will begin a series on justification by faith, and this is going to lead to a spiritual revival. And he's going to see 6 sudden conversions, and by the spring, they're seeing about 30 conversions a week. Let me just say a little bit. I'm confused, and I don't have the definitive answer here about Edwards' preaching style, because you read two very different things. Some people say that he was not a very good preacher in terms of delivery, that he just sort of read, and he would occasionally, they described it as the whale. He goes down, he's reading his notes, then he would come up for a breath of air, and then he goes back down. And that the power of Edwards' preaching is sort of all the Spirit of God working and the intellect, the clarity, the insights that he brings. One quote here, he scarcely gestured or ever moved, and he made no attempt by the elegance of his style or the beauty of his pictures to gratify the taste and fascinate the imagination. Instead, he convinced with overwhelming weight of argument and with such intensity of feelings. So some say he wasn't a very charismatic preacher. Others say he really was, and that the rap of him being boring or monotone was not fair. So Edwards will keep, by the way, he writes a lot of things down. And so he will keep journals, and he will keep fairly developed written accounts of his pastoral observations and how many people are coming to faith and all kinds of prayer requests and other things. This will come out in 1737 in a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God. And this book will be widely read, including by Whitefield. Whitefield will read this book, and it will contribute to his understanding of what God is doing and the Great Awakening. And many people sort of credit this book with being one of the catalysts for the Great Awakening. Certainly because Whitefield read it. When Whitefield comes to the States and he's preaching up and down on his fundraising tours, raising money for the orphanage in Georgia, Whitefield will go up and will spend time with Edwards, and Edwards will move Whitefield from being more of a Wesleyan or of a Arminian to being more of a Calvinist. But on July 8th, 1741, while being a guest preacher in Enfield, Connecticut, a congregation nearby, he delivers his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It's based out of Deuteronomy 32, and people respond in a very big, profound way. At the climax, he said, quote, "O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in," the danger of facing the judgment of God. In response, the congregation broke out with loud shrieks and wails, so great that he could not finish the sermon. So Edwards will write more about this in 7-8 years later, 1749. He writes an account of the life of the late Reverend David Brainerd, which will describe Brainerd's work among the Indians there as a missionary. And Brainerd will describe the same kind of thing, that the power of God descended on the assembly like a rushing mighty wind. So Edwards will note over the next month, after he preaches this sermon, 300 conversions. So at some point, as we're moving through the early 1740s, so many people come to faith that Edwards, who is a post-millenarian, so today most evangelicals are pre-millenarians. That is, when you think about the millennium, the 1,000-year period of Christ's reign, they would say that we are living before the 1,000 years and that Jesus will return before the 1,000 years. There are amillenarians that say the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth is actually more figurative, and that 1,000-year period is going to happen in heaven. So anytime you have the letter A, alpha, before a letter, it negates what's being said. So a theist believes in God, an atheist does not believe in God. Gnosticism is all about knowledge, gnosis. An agnostic is somebody that doesn't believe you can know. So a millenarian believes in the 1,000-year earthly reign of Christ, and a millenarian does not believe there's a 1,000-year earthly reign of Christ, that Christ is ruling in heaven. The post-millenarians believed that as the gospel spread, as people came to faith, that the world would get better and better, and that Jesus will return at the end of that 1,000-year period. So not many post-millenarians left. It was sort of prominent early on, Augustine and some first millennium people, but not many 21st century theologians that are post-mill. But Edwards was, and he thinks in the mid-1740s that the millennium may be about to begin, because he's seeing everybody come to faith. But then people start to lose their zeal. Again, we see these times of spiritual apathy followed by renewal, followed by apathy, right? We see that throughout church history. And so at this point is when Edwards begins to challenge the church membership of some people to whom it had been extended, and now he is not sure that it ought to have been extended, and should these new people who are not as zealous for Christ be allowed into the church? And this is going to lead to this crisis, and Edwards, to this conflict with the church members, and Edwards will be voted out. So Jonathan Edwards, who arguably has the most famous sermon in American church history, is fired by his congregation. Jonathan Edwards, who's believed to be the smartest person born in North America, is fired by his congregation. He will, for a while, a couple years, serve as a missionary to the native population. And so he'll work with the Indians, and while he's doing this, he will do some writing, freedom of the will, writes about God's providence and some other things. And then in 1758, he becomes, I think, the first or one of the very first presidents of the Log College or Log Cabin College, which will eventually become Princeton. And the presidents of colleges, and this is all these schools, we're going to look at this in a couple episodes, all these schools are led for the next couple hundred years, are to train pastors, and they're led by pastors. And the president is sort of the one that's doing a lot of the teaching. So he does that for a little while. He actually dies of the smallpox. He takes, I hardly even want to touch this right now, but he takes the new smallpox vaccine and he gets smallpox and he dies. He's 55. He leaves no small legacy. If you don't get my Friday update, you don't maybe know this, but in this week's Friday update, I did this comparison between Max Jukes and Jonathan Edwards 150 years later, where you compare their legacies. And Edwards' legacy, just in terms of the number of, there's a vice president and 3 senators and 6 governors and 30 doctors and 40 missionaries and all these college presidents, just to this very distinguished lineage of Edwards' descendants. And the Max Jukes has the unfortunate fact that he gets compared with Edwards, and Jukes was a thief, and he has 80 of his descendants are thieves or go to prison or die young or prostitutes. I mean, it's quite a comparison. So Edwards has this prominent legacy. In addition to that, we can say, many people would say, alongside Reinhold Niebuhr, Edwards will be hailed as the greatest American theologian. So a few things to note about Edwards. Unlike the Wesleys and Whitefield, he doesn't take to the road and do a lot of preaching up and down, traveling around like they did. He sort of is a pastor at a church, also an author. He's very disciplined, again, rises at 4 o'clock in the morning, studies for 13 hours a day. Apparently doesn't have a Netflix account or follow any of the Boston sports franchises. It's interesting to note, in spite of his brilliance, again, publishing a science article at 11, he gets written off by some people as being an enthusiast, which was a derogatory term to say, sort of swept up in the emotions of faith. He doesn't really reject that term. I mean, it's a derogatory term, but he will write about the need for religious affections, the need for our heart to love God because we're going to follow our heart. So one of his more prominent books is called The Treatise on Religious Affections and Some Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival of Religion in New England. Gotta love those old titles. They leave nothing to the imagination. Also worth noting that in an era when churches gathered together to sing psalms, Edwards was a radical in the worship wars, and he endorsed the hymn singing, this new thing that was being cultivated by Isaac Watts and others. So let me say a few more things about the Great Awakening here as I'm starting to head towards the finish line. So First Great Awakening, so 18th century, religious revival, both sides of the pond, Whitefield's, Wesley's, Edwards, and others, mostly conducted outside the formal church. And a revival, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of sort of very visible spiritual response. It's worth noting, if you read about the First Great Awakening, and generally if you read about any revival, it's preceded by prayer. So a lot of prayer. I was reading one report, and in 1739, you've got this meeting, this prayer meeting that's going on with Wesley and Whitefield at it, and about 60 other of their associates, and they're praying. And it says, this is a prayer meeting at Fetters Lane, and it says, at 3 a.m., the power of God came mightily upon us, insomuch that many cried out exceedingly for joy, and many fell to the ground. So what stood out to me was at 3 a.m. So they have been praying. They're either up really, really early to pray, or they have been praying through the night. Secondly, just as I said before, note that the Great Awakening, this revival, is not unique in the sense that there's almost no revivals. There's often revivals in churches, in families, in cities. There can be revivals. When I was a college pastor, there was in the early 90s, there was or late 80s, there was a time in which we saw sort of revival hit some college campuses. There's a book written about it called When God Walked on Campus. And so we'll see some revivals happen. What makes the Great Awakening great is the size and scope of it. I've already talked a little bit about the descriptions of these times. It's worth noting that initially, when Wesley starts to take over for Whitefield, so Whitefield is preaching and having great response. Wesley had not had a big response when he had come to the U.S. initially, but he comes back over and he will start to preach and come alongside and sort of complement some of what Whitefield is doing. Wesley's scared by the response, and he doesn't know what to make of it. He becomes convinced that it is clearly a move of God, but he's scared initially. And Wesley will be at times, he will report that he's in the middle of 50 riots, that these gatherings either become revivals or they become riots, and that at one point he feared for his life. I've got one description here. You see them dropping on all sides as thunderstruck. Listeners are thrown into convulsions, screaming, groaning, fainting, beating the ground, laughing uncontrollably. There are claims of healings and exorcisms. So this is some animated stuff. Worth noting that the Great Awakening has significant influence. So we could talk about the Great Awakening a little bit like we talk about the Reformation, that not as big or as much of a sort of global lever as the Reformation, but the Great Awakening will change a lot of things. So some of the things that will happen is that the Great Awakening, some will say, is going to lead up to and sort of fuel the Revolutionary War. That as Americans are sort of spiritually revived, some of them will start to say, we have no king but Jesus. And others, as they get involved in churches, and churches will start to grow again, and as they get involved in churches, these churches have congregational aspects to them. They're voting on pastors or voting on leaders or voting on some things. This will help fuel a mindset of democracy and voting and that kind of thing. Others will say that the Great Awakening is going to lead towards fundamentalism, which is basically sort of a challenge to progress and modernity. It's complicated. I'm going to give a talk on fundamentalism later on. The term is so negative right now. There's some things about early fundamentalism to say, oh, well, that's not bad. But it's complicated, so I'll simply say I'm not convinced that the Great Awakening leads to fundamentalism. Fundamentalism doesn't start for about 100 years, so I'm not sure I can connect the dots on that. But there will be this somewhat American, and now it's not American, it's very much the norm in Central South America, Africa, of an emotional, Pentecostal kind of church and church meeting. There will be also changes in the colonies because of the Great Awakening. Not just are you going to see lots more people in church and all the stuff that sort of rolls out of that, but it connects, the Great Awakening connects the colonies. And the fact that it's an intra-denominational activity, that you've now got Quakers and Baptists and Presbyterians and Episcopalians and everybody together at these outdoor church events. It's going to sort of break down some of the heavy denominational borders that had existed. You will see the growth of Methodism coming out of the Great Awakening. Again, the Wesleys will establish methods for growing small groups and growing societies. They won't call them churches initially because, again, they're still Anglican, but in many cases, these societies sure look like churches. And by the way, remember, Wesleys were going to sort of ordain or license or launch a whole bunch of lay preachers, and they're going to spread. They're going to help grow this movement in Europe, but in particular in the United States, and especially as the church begins to grow and as America begins to grow west. And I ran across this great line. So Wesley, in the 1790s, the Methodist Church has 200 lay preachers. One critic described them as, quote, a ragged legion of preaching barbers, cobblers, tinkers, scavengers, draymen, and chimney sweepers. I don't think that he's listing those occupations in a positive light. So we'll see growth in churches, and the Great Awakening is going to be part of the American culture. It's going to shape the U.S., and there will be, again, a second Great Awakening that will be happening not too long in the future. So that's it for now. Coming up in future episodes as we move through the century, we're going to look at Adam Smith, the author of Wealth of Nations, sort of the advocate of capitalism, and see Christians' influence there, as well as how capitalism influences Christianity. We're going to look at the rise of higher education, very much a Christian project for the first couple hundred years in the United States. And we will also be moving towards a deeper dive on the founding of America. See you next time.